All right. Well, welcome everyone to our uh, March webinar, which also serves the purpose of helping to prepare all of our advocates for the legislative day that is coming up next week. I cannot believe we are already pretty much at the middle of March, and it is time to go to the state capitol for our legislative day. So, let me just go over a couple of quick things. I want to thank our sponsors who you can see on the screen who sponsor our entire webinar series. And I think probably most of you are already familiar with the council and our mission. But just a quick reminder, that our mission is to improve access to care and treatment options in order to advance the quality of life for people with bleeding disorders through advocacy, education, and outreach in collaboration with our member organizations. Okay, so I am going to jump in here a little bit and we will get started with our main content for this evening, which is to share with all of you what we will be talking about at Legislative Day and also give you some tips for how to prepare for that. I'm checking to see if Carson has been able to join us yet. Oh, here he is. So we are going to talk about how to share a little bit about how to share your bleeding disorder story. We are also going to talk about how we are trying to amplify the patient voice in support of AB 278. And Carson is going to help me with that in just a moment. And then we're also going to be advocating, as we usually do, for full funding of CCS, GHPP, and Medi-Cal. And then I'm going to touch a little bit briefly on the Bleeding Disorder Substance Use and Mental Health Access Coalition. And there will be you'll see some sheets in your packet when we distribute those as well that will advocate on behalf of patients having access to mental health and substance use treatment facilities. So, Carson, I think you just were able to join us. So did you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, can everybody hear me, see me, things like that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. It's been a hectic day today, so I hopped on a few minutes late. But hello, folks. My name is Carson Knight. I'm a legislative assistant for Assemblywoman Ransom, who's the assembly member that has authored AB 278, like Lynn mentioned. I'm also a former future leader, have a bleeding disorder myself. So very happy and excited to be here to explain a little bit about what the bill does, help you all figure out how you want to talk to legislators. I have a little bit of advice from the Assemblywoman herself, but I will turn it back over to Lynn until it's my turn.
Awesome.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks, Carson. And feel free to interject as we go through these slides too. We will work together on that. So jumping in, I want to start out by kind of a little bit of a reminder. Like typically in every meeting, we kind of start out by trying to level the playing field and explain what a bleeding disorder is, right? Because the staff or the member that you're meeting with may or may not know um, anything about a bleeding disorder. So a great thing to do at the beginning of the meeting is to just even after you kind of do your round of introductions, and we'll talk about that format in a little bit, but is to just ask the person that you're meeting with, hey, are you familiar with bleeding disorders? I was in Washington, D.C. last week, and one of the staff people that I met with was new. We hadn't met with this person previously. And so I started out with that question. And he was like, actually, growing up, there was a family friend of ours who had hemophilia. And I remember he's like, I think it was hemophilia. I'm pretty sure it was hemophilia B. And I was like, yeah, that certainly could be the case. And he was a little bit familiar with some of the things that his friend had to do, right? So that was a great starting points of the conversation to find out that he had this personal connection with bleeding disorders. So that's always a great place to start. And then you want to, you want to try to use pretty simple terms to explain it, and avoid jargon or acronyms that people might not understand. And really, you can personalize it by explaining your connection to the bleeding disorders community to kind of illustrate what is a bleeding disorder and how it affects people, right? And we recognize that some of the folks that are going to be participating, some of you are, allies of the bleeding disorder community, family members, right? And so your bleeding disorder story might have to do with a parent or a sibling, a friend, right? And that's totally wonderful as well that you're here, as support for the bleeding disorders community, whether or not you have a bleeding disorder yourself. So does anyone feel brave and want to unmute and briefly say how maybe in 2 or 3 sentences, how they explain a bleeding disorder? What would you say to explain to someone who is not familiar with bleeding disorder in simple terms? What is a bleeding disorder? See if anyone raises their hands, or I might just call on someone. I don't see any hands popping up. Let me think. Let me see who some of the folks who I know this is not their first time at Legislative Day who might be able to share what they say. Hey, Mia, how about Mia? Are you somewhere where you can unmute and share what you would say about what a bleeding disorder is?
Yes, hello everybody. I would say just off the top of my head, a bleeding disorder is something that I have where my blood doesn't clot. I have to take a little bit extra precaution when doing normal activities and things, but it doesn't mean I can't live my life any differently than anybody else. Yeah, I would. That's my basic definition for sure.
Awesome. Thanks, Mia.
Oh, that's for Benjamin. Can you put on the chair for him? That's
So feel free also if anyone else has a couple sentences, 1 or 2 sentences that they would say about what a bleeding disorder is, feel free to put those examples in the chat. It's always great to see how other people describe it. And there really aren't any wrong answers, right? Because you're telling your personal story about what it's like to have a bleeding disorder and live with a bleeding disorder. All right. So up next, Carson, I'm going to let you take the first stab at this, but we're going to talk a little bit about the bill that we're going to be speaking to legislators and their staff about next week. And so do you want to give maybe like a little brief introduction to what is the Office of Healthcare Affordability and then what the bill does?
Sure, happy to. Okay, so like Lynn mentioned before, there's a whole lot of jargon around here. We like to try and avoid using jargon, so let me know if anything that I say doesn't make sense. But so the Office of Healthcare Affordability, like it says on the slides, it was created in 2022. It was created in large part thanks to Governor Newsom, that wanted to create this to lower the costs of healthcare. I think, as probably most of us know, healthcare is very, very expensive. I think, especially in California, depending on where you're at, getting access to even some pretty basic care can be very costly. So the Office of Healthcare Affordability was created to find ways to lower those costs. They have a whole bunch of different things that they've been asked to do through the law that created them. So there's a whole laundry list. Some of those things are creating a cost spending target, for example, that says that, certain, say, like hospitals can only increase their total costs by so much each year. So, for example, you say 3%. So they can only increase their costs by a maximum of 3% every year as a way to curb the rate at which your costs go up. So that's what the Office of Healthcare Affordability was created to do. It has a few parts to it. there's a board, if I remember right, and I could be wrong about this. The voting board has 5 members, and Lynn, if I'm wrong, shake your head at me or something, but I think it's 5 members. They're each put on there in different ways. Some of them are appointed by members of the legislature, others are appointed by the governor, etc. But those are the folks that get to vote and make decisions about what the law is going to be. So, say if they wanted to decide there's a 3% cost target, like I just mentioned, that would be something that the board votes on. If they all agree, then that becomes the law, and whoever they've passed a law to impact needs to do that, or I should say a regulation, not a law. They also have an advisory committee. The advisory committee has 28 different members on it, and people can apply to join it. There's certain requirements, but usually I think every year they put out a request and say, if you would like to join the advisory committee, submit your application here. The advisory committee is a whole bunch of different folks. So there's some people that represent different hospitals or health systems. There are some that represent doctors. There are some that represent healthcare workers and their labor unions, and there's et cetera, et cetera. There's almost 30 of them. So it's quite a big committee. And they will meet and they'll discuss anything that the board that I mentioned asks them to discuss, or they'll come up with their own things that they want to talk about that they think are important for the voting board to consider when they're making their decisions. So they meet, I believe, at least 4 times a year, sometimes more, and they will have discussions about what they think is important. There's a pretty wide range of folks that are on that board, and they come up with a list of recommendations and advice and information and things like that, and they provide that to the board so that when the board votes, they have basically like a PowerPoint presentation of all of the different things that the advisory committee thinks that they need to know. So how that ties into the bill here, AB 278, is the goal of this bill is to make sure that people with rare, chronic, terminal, and also mental and behavioral health conditions have a voice in that advisory committee process. So we're not trying to say that these folks are on the voting board, those 5 members. What the bill would do is it would create an 8-person patient advocacy advisory committee, like you see on the slides there. And it would have 2 representatives for rare conditions, 2 representatives for chronic conditions, 2 representatives for people with terminal illnesses, and 2 representatives for people with mental and behavioral health conditions. And so they would meet just like the big 28-person advisory committee meets. They would meet somewhat regularly, and they would discuss their own issues. As you all probably know, if you live with a rare disease, you've got a whole other set of considerations compared to something like a hospital. Like Kaiser has a whole different list of priorities than people with hemophilia or von Willebrand's or something like cystic fibrosis, all of these conditions. We obviously have a whole different list of concerns, and you want to make sure that folks that have those conditions are making their voice heard. As we all know, people with rare diseases tend to also have some of the most expensive treatments. They need the most regular care, things like that. So as we're trying to lower costs and make healthcare cheaper for everybody, the only concern that I think the rare disease community has is we want to make sure that making things cheaper doesn't mean that we just don't get access to the expensive medication, because you need the expensive medication. If there's ways to lower healthcare costs that don't do that, I think they would be all in favor. But so AB 278 would create that 8-person new advisory committee to make sure that these patients and patient advocates have a space to make themselves heard. Lynn, if you've got additional information there, by all means jump in. But if folks have questions about that, or want me to go over anything again, I'm very happy to do so.
Yeah, just so one thing, I looked it up while you were talking. There are 8 voting board members, and then 28 like you stated, 28 members of the currently on the advisory committee or advisory board. But I do think this is a great time to pause briefly and ask if anyone has any questions about what is the Office of Healthcare Affordability and what AB 278 or our bill does. I will also and I probably should have said this earlier, we're going to go through a little bit more of the logistics and, you know, all of that in a minute, but you will have handouts that have like the bill number on it and other toolkit information, talking points, etc., that will help you. So you do not have to feel like you're going to have to remember all this off the top of your head. And every group will be a mix of people who have experience doing this and maybe some people who are newer at it, right? So nobody will be going into any meetings by themselves, and you will definitely have at least one or two experienced advocates in every group. So please don't feel anxious if this is your first time and we're throwing a bunch of information at you that is new. So with that, feel free to use the raise your hand feature or just unmute yourself or type it into the chat, whatever is easiest and most comfortable for you. Does anyone have any questions that have come to mind as it relates to what is this Office of Healthcare Affordability and what the purpose of this bill is? Okay. I'm not hearing any at the moment, so we're going to keep going. If something pops into your mind while we're talking about other things, please feel free to throw your question in the chat and we will discuss and have more opportunity for questions. Was that somebody having a question before we move on? Okay. So we also, and this is something that if you've participated in the past with any of our advocacy, I'm sure that you have heard us talk about this before, right? We always want to reiterate our support for full funding for CCS or California Children's Services, GHPP, the Genetically Handicapped Persons Program, and Medi-Cal. Now, least anyone be worried at this point in the governor's proposed budget, he is recommending full funding for those programs. So we, at this point, do not anticipate those programs being cut this year. Now, I'm going to give a caveat to that. That is, I'm sure that we are all, you know, have at least seen some level of what's going on at the federal government due to the change of administration. And there is a concern that the federal government is going to cut funding for, and you may have heard the term Medicaid, right? And sometimes that's a little bit confusing for Californians because in California, we call our Medicaid program Medi-Cal, right? And so Medicaid is the federal name that covers all the states, and Medi-Cal is what we call that same program here in California. And we receive a very significant amount of federal funds, billions of dollars, every year to fund Medi-Cal. And the state also puts tax dollars and money towards that as well. But if there were to be significant cuts from the federal government, then it would become more difficult for California to fully fund those programs. I cannot say for certain what would happen. It would depend on how large the cut was, you know, et cetera. But that's kind of the caveat. So right now, the budget situation in California looks pretty good, and the governor is recommending full funding for those programs. But again, we, especially in a year like this year, want to communicate to our legislators how important those programs are for our community. Some of you may utilize one or more of those programs, or your family members may. Around 50% of the bleeding disorders community in California is covered by one of those three programs. Others of you may be on private insurance or a covered California plan. But I think we all can relate to how important it is to have insurance to be able to cover our healthcare. Any of us in the bleeding disorders community know that it would really be impossible to get the care we need without good health coverage. So if you have utilized one of those programs, a great strategy would be to share that story during your meetings with legislators. And another great thing would be to say thank you. Thank you for supporting these programs in the past. Most of the legislators that, maybe not every legislator we're meeting with has voted on this in the past and supported it, but in general, California has had strong support for these programs. And so you can put it in the context of, thanking the state of California for having these important programs to support us. Does anyone have any questions on the budget and specifically, how we want to speak to the issues with CCS, GHPP, and Medi-Cal? Again, please don't feel like you can't ask questions. I'm sure that you are not the only one with the question that's in the back of your mind. But if you aren't comfortable asking it in a large group, you can always reach out to me via email as well, or like private message me in the chat, and then I can share the question and the answer without identifying people, if that makes you more comfortable as well. But yeah, don't hesitate to speak up if you have a question. Because I'm sure that the response will be helpful to more than just you on the call. So, okay. All right. So those, I'll touch on the BD-SUMEC issues, the Bleeding Disorders, Substance Use, Mental Health Access Coalition at the end. But because the bill and the budget requests are really our two main issues that we want to talk about. So we're going to transition a little bit to kind of preparing for your visit and how you want to go about meeting with legislators and staff. So we have some bullet points here, but before we jump into the bullet points, Carson, do you want to maybe share some thoughts about how you would recommend they approach meeting with their legislators on Monday?
Absolutely. So first off, I think I've met a bunch of you last year, just looking through who's on the call. So you might have heard a little bit of this advice when I came by last year. But the first thing I like to tell folks is that when you're meeting with somebody, whether it's an actual, like a senator or an assembly member, or if it's a staff person like myself, very important to remember they're just a human being. Not only that, but if you think that just this, say this bill is complicated, they receive, I want to say, 500 emails a week about completely different things. They're getting, hit 6 ways from Sunday with the most complicated acronyms that you've ever heard of, and they don't know what that is either. They're learning about it on the fly. There's 30 something different brand new legislators that have only been doing their job since early December when they got sworn in after the election. So a lot of them are learning on the fly, just like you. If they ask you a question, they're not trying to trip you up or anything like that. They are just genuinely wondering maybe like what you mean. Some of them will know if you say OCA, which is the Office of Healthcare Affordability. Some of them are going to know exactly what that means, and others are going to look at you like you're kind of crazy because they've never heard the term OCA before. So don't be, afraid or nervous. They're not judging you. They're probably excited that you're there, especially if you're actually meeting with the senator or the assembly member and you're their constituent. So they represent you. Like, say, I'm from Santa Barbara. So if I met with Senator Limon in a legislative visit, I would hope she's probably just excited to see people from her district traveling all the way up. It's like a 5.5, 6 hour drive, or an hour-long flight just to come see her. So they will be excited to see you there. That being said, I told Assemblywoman Ransom that I was going to come here before I did, and I asked her if there was anything that she wanted me to pass along. I said, is there any advice that you would give to folks? I said, everybody from high school to our seasoned professionals that are going to come meet with your colleagues, with other legislators. And she sort of thought for a moment, and she said, I would say learn something about them before you come and meet with them. She said it's always exciting when folks come and meet with her, and they'll mention, like, for example, she used to be on city council in Tracy, and sometimes people will mention that, and they'll know some things that she did when she was there, and she's so excited about that. Now, if you're not from Assemblywoman Ransom's district, you might not know that she was on Tracy City Council or that she ran a nonprofit or things like that. But if you're visiting, the senator that represents you, and you maybe look them up on Wikipedia, things like that, or you remember them from something you saw in the paper or on the local news, things like that, and you just mention that in conversation, they'll be excited. They might know that you're from their district, but it's one thing to know, like, oh, this person's from, one of my towns. And it's another for them to connect that to, like, oh, yeah, I know you. I've seen your face, or I've seen you at an event in the past. They get really excited about that. I think especially the newer members that are meeting constituents for the first time as a new elected official. So if you know who you're meeting with, if you get your schedule and you know who your visits are, you know who your elected officials are, do a quick Google search on them and just see what you can find. You might learn some stuff. It might be informative just to sort of know, what they did in the past and sort of where they're coming from. We have some legislators that were attorneys. We have some that were school teachers. We have some that are military veterans, things like that. So they have a really wide background, just like most of the folks here. I think the common unifier here is you've either got a bleeding disorder or you know somebody that has one. Their common denominator is that they're legislators, but beyond that, they are vastly different. They're very different personalities. Some of them are real happy, and some of them probably have 20 other meetings to make that day. So my advice is just remember that they're human. You might see them in the hallway afterwards. I said last year, if you meet with a staff person, don't get stressed out because you might see them, in the bathroom. You might see them eating their lunch in the hall later. Like, they're pretty normal folks. I've gotten to know a good number of them, and they're genuinely good people. They know that you're there because, you didn't just come up for the weekend because you thought it'd be cool. I mean, it is cool, but you came up here for a reason, and they're super excited to see that. It's not every day that you have actual people with conditions coming up to talk to you about what's important to them. So yeah, I would also say, I'm sure Lynn would mention this too, but if somebody asks you a question and you genuinely don't know the answer, or you think maybe you know the answer, but you're not super sure, just tell them that. Don't try and make something up because they might like go look it up later because they're interested and realize that that's not actually how something works. I don't know that they're going to be upset, but they will be very confused. So if somebody asks you something really complicated, tell them like you can circle back, or that you'll provide them with contact information, whether it's for Lynn, whether it's for myself as the Assemblywoman's staff person. Let them know that there's somebody that can answer their questions, but don't try and answer a question you don't know the answer to. That being said, they won't try and trip you up. If they do try and trip you up, it would be unheard of, and they're probably having a terrible day. But I think folks would be excited to see you. I'm always available to answer questions, things like that. And it's a very large building. Like Lynn mentioned, I think it was on the slides. You will go through security too. So if you've been to the airport, you're very familiar. You're going to go through the little machine. It's just a metal detector, and you'll put your bags in something that will just scan your bags. It's not nearly as intense as actually going through like TSA at the airport. You can bring food, you can bring water, nothing like that. The only stuff they're looking for is weapons, really. If you have pepper spray on your keychain, because I know some people have that, they will be worried about that. They will take it from you at security, but you can get it back. So they'll ask for your name and things like that, and they'll just hold it until you leave. And then you can go to where they tell you and you can pick that up. But if you have like a little pocket knife or something like that on your keychain or in your pocket, do yourself a favor, don't bring it with you. It will make it very easy for yourself if you just leave the fun little knickknacks and tools and Swiss Army knife, things like that at home. But yeah, it will probably be a very busy day at the Capitol. So expect to see swarms and swarms of people around there. Just try your best not to be late and call folks if you know you're going to be late, just to give that office a heads up. That being said, I am always here to answer questions. If anybody has questions about the long pitch that I just had for you about what it's going to be like to come talk to my colleagues here in the legislature.
Yeah, that was lots of good advice, Carson, and we'll reiterate a few points here. So as far as the logistics go, and you will get an email by the end of the week that will have some of these details and reminders. But you should have already seen we are having it sort of like our pre-meeting where we'll gather all together beforehand. You'll check in, you'll get breakfast. We'll kind of go back over a few of these reminders. And that will be at the Secretary of State's office building, which is right across the street from the swing space where many legislators' offices are, almost all of them. So if you were with us in the last couple of years, you probably remember that the actual Capitol building is under construction right now. So part of it is still open. Sort of the main old part of the building is still open, and that's where the members go to have floor session for like the Senate and Assembly floor sessions. And there's a couple of committee rooms that are still there. But where all of the offices and a lot of the committee hearing rooms used to be, has actually been demolished. They're finishing the demolition and then they're going to build a new building on the backside. So while all of that is happening, those committees and member offices have been relocated to a new office building across the street from the Secretary of State's, about a block away from the Capitol. And that is where we will be going for our meetings. So couple things. When you arrive at the Secretary of State's building, you do not have to go through metal detectors at that point, but you do have to show ID. And so make sure that you have like your driver's license or a student ID, maybe for those of you that are students, that you can show on the way going through into the Secretary of State's building. And then when it is time to go over to the swing space for our meetings, and there's only one member that is not in that building, Assembly Member Mia Bonta, who's the chair of the Assembly Health Committee, is in the Legislative Office building with the health staff. When we go to those meetings, you will go through security. So it's like Carson said, it's basically like going through airport security with a couple of caveats. You do not have to take off your shoes, and it's okay. It's still okay to bring like a water bottle with you. It'll just go through the screening like everything else. So that so you can bring water with you. And then if you get to legislative day, like you get to the Secretary of State's office and you realize, oh, I left my pocket knife in my backpack, or oh, I didn't take the pepper spray off my keychain, like Carson reminded me that I should do. Although those of you who are flying will have already had to deal with those things and probably had them confiscated at the airport. But if you're driving and you forget to remove those things, we will have people, some volunteers that will be at the Secretary of State's office the whole time that meetings are happening. So you could leave those items at in our space that we're having meetings at in the Secretary of State's office, and then just don't take them across to the swing space for the meetings. Business tire is appropriate, but you may want to have a little bit more comfortable shoes, because there's kind of often a lot of walking between spaces. The forecast is not looking super promising. It may be raining, so I would encourage you to bring a rain jacket or an umbrella. As I said, great thing is it's a very, very short walk between the Secretary of State's building and the swing space building where you're going for your meetings. So you won't have to be walking a lot from that perspective, but you may have to walk a greater distance from like where you park your car, for example, to come into the original meeting space. And then we talked about security. You want to arrive early. We'll make sure that you have time to get through security and also then go find the correct room to go to, etc. we highly encourage you, do not be late for your meeting. But like Carson mentioned, if something happens outside your control and you're running late, couple options, right? Nobody is going to meetings by themselves. So it's most likely that not all of you will be running late. So some folks can go ahead and start the meeting and you can join them. But if for whatever reason, maybe your whole group got delayed and the meeting that you were in prior ran long, make sure that you contact the office and let them know that you're on your way. And then we will have a few red ties and scarves if you don't already have one, that you can wear to kind of symbolize, our red ties. But if you have your own red tie, or you have a red scarf, or like a red ribbon you want to put in your hair, or anything along those lines, we encourage folks to bring something to sort of be that symbol that we often use. And a lot of groups in the Capitol, a lot of staff in particular that have been around the Capitol for a while, know us by that, know us as the red tie group. So, and there was a question that came in to me earlier, and that was, how many of the people that we're meeting with already know about hemophilia or bleeding disorders? And so I don't have an exact number, but I'm going to answer that two ways for you. One, the council has been doing an annual legislative day and coming and talking to folks about bleeding disorders for nearly 30 years at this point. So many staff in particular are a little bit familiar with bleeding disorders because we've been coming year after year and sharing our stories and talking to them. And even though they may have worked for a different member in the past, they may have met with us before. So a good number of them will be a little bit familiar. But Carson also mentioned, out of the 120 members, I think there's close to 40 of them that are brand new members. Right now, some of their staff may not be brand new because they may have previously worked in the legislature for another member, but they may not be familiar with bleeding disorders because they are new. So it's always good to ask, as I said, up front in your initial, at the beginning of your meeting, and see what they know or don't know. So those are some good things to keep in mind. So kind of how the meetings will go. And again, like I said, every group will have, a group leader that can kind of help you be organized, and who has experience doing these meetings. But what you're going to do is you're typically going to go as a group, from our meeting space over to the swing space for your meetings. Make sure your whole group is together, and then you're going to check in at the front desk. Many of our meetings will be with staff. Members are very busy. They're going to they have floor session on Monday. They may have committee meetings that they need to go to, either as a member of that committee or because they're presenting their own bills. So do not be offended if you're meeting with staff. Please never say, especially in front of staff, oh, we're just meeting with staff, because they will brief the member and pass that information along, and they may have more experience. The staff member may have more experience in that policy area than the member does. It's very possible. Carson, did you have something to add?
I did. As a staffer, I can second the thing. If you meet with staff, don't say it's just staff. Staff are not judgmental people, but if you tell them, oh, it's just staff, I don't think they tend to take that well. They won't tell you anything, but they won't feel nice about it. I would also second what Lynn said, that because these elected officials are so completely slammed, like their calendars are busy from 8 a.m. to like 6 or 7 p.m. every single day of the week, and it's been scheduled out for months. The staff are usually the ones that get to sit down and really get into like the details and the nitty gritty on stuff. So it's sort of like everybody, like you might be really interested in a few things. Like some people are really interested in like agriculture and like housing. And so maybe that particular, say, senator knows a lot about those two like issue areas. but they might not know a lot about healthcare. So if you meet with their staff person that works on healthcare issues, that staff person might know more than the member does. And so they're going to be the best person for you to talk to, because they're going to be the person that forms the opinion about it. And that's going to be the person that that legislator trusts. If that person says, like, hey, I really think this is a good bill, I think you should support it, they're going to trust what that staff member says most of the time. Not all the time, but I would say most of the time. And if they say, hey, this is not a good bill, don't vote for it, they might also trust them on that too. So it's always good to know, like, staff make a whole lot of decisions. They're the ones that recommend what decision a legislator should make. They might say, I say you should vote aye on this. You should vote yes. They might say you should vote no. That legislator is going to make their own decision, but it's probably going to be very heavily based on what their staff tell them. So as a staff person, be nice to staff. They're good folks, and they're very knowledgeable about a lot of things. They're also very busy. But yeah, that's my spiel.
Absolutely. And some others have reiterated that in the chat as well. So when you go into your meeting, again, whether it's with a legislator or with staff, you're always going to want to start with introductions. You will always have at least one person in your group that is a constituent in that office. And the schedules will help you see who is the constituent in that office. So we typically encourage the constituent to be sort of the first one to introduce themselves, and make sure you point out, like, oh, I live in such and such a city. And that's where, to the Carson's point earlier, where we talked about, maybe doing a little research on the members that you're going to meet with. If you can find something about them that you can make a personal connection to, that is super helpful. And you can say, oh, I'm from this city in your district, and connect with them on that front. But then everyone in the group should at least briefly introduce themselves and kind of share their connection. And then your group leader will help you organize this. But, one or two, most meetings are going to be 15, 20 minutes maximum. So, we don't have time for every person to tell their story at length, and most groups will have like 5, 6 people in them. So you're going to pick like 1 or 2 people to tell their story in that each meeting. And you can switch it around as you go to your different meetings. And then maybe like one, a different person, the asks that we have when we're then asking them to support the bill and asking them to support the budget request. You can have different people then take those points too. So you can kind of move it around your group. And, we want to use persuasion. There's no need to be confrontational in the meetings. We're going to stick to the issues that we're focused on as part of our lobby day and not bring in outside issues. And really just make sure that you're representing yourself and the bleeding disorders community well, as you communicate. As we said, they typically are not going to be confrontational back to you. They may ask questions, but they're just asking questions because they're interested and they want to learn more. That's usually a really good sign of engagement from the staff or the member if they're asking you questions. And they're not trying to trip you up, but as has already been stated, like, never try to answer a question that you don't know the answer to. And, for one, there may be somebody else in your group. Like, if you're the person presenting and you're not sure of the answer, there may be someone else in the group that can jump in and answer that. But if no one in your group is confident of the answer, you can say, hey, that's a great question. Let me write that down, and I will have someone follow up with you about that. And then you can bring that back to me, to Andrea. We'll take note of that, and myself or Cher Gonzalez, our lobbyist, or Carson, if it's appropriate, if it relates to the bill, we can follow back up with that office and get them the answer to the question. So we would also encourage you to take a picture, but I will add this caveat, and that is, you always want to ask first before you take pictures in the office. I was just in Washington, D.C., and several of the offices I was in, They were fine with us taking like a picture with the staff outside or like after the meeting was over, but they didn't want us to take actual action shots during the meetings. And that was their office policy. Excuse me. And so we just always want to be respectful and ask before we take the picture. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, they are familiar with this request. They get it all the time. They will be happy for you to take a picture, and they're happy for you to give their boss a shout out on social media, which is really why we want the pictures, right? And so we'll touch on that briefly in a minute. What we want you to do with those pictures once you've taken them. So again, Carson communicated this really well. Legislators and staff are people too. Don't feel like you need to be intimidated. You know, they want to hear your stories. They are going to be interested in your stories. And then, you know, but be concise. Again, you only have 15, maybe 20 minutes max. So, you know, kind of get through your story, make your requests before you run out of that time frame. And then some follow-up. What are you going to do to follow up, right? So you're going to want to try to get a business card, and most offices have like a you know, collection of business cards at the front for all the staff that works in that office. Get a business card of the staff person that you met with so that you can send them a thank you. Then you're going to engage on social media and the hashtags that we're using. So if you have social media, please feel free to, you know, post you know, positive messages about the meetings that you had with these legislators, thank them for their time. If they commit to support something, you can, you know, give them a shout out for that. Even if they didn't commit to it, you can say, like, we had a great meeting today talking with legislator so-and-so about this issue, right? Don't ever put words in their mouth if they didn't promise to support something. Don't say that they're planning to support something, but you want to put it, excuse me, in a positive spin. And then every group will be letting us know, like the group leader or someone that they designate will be following up with us to share how your meetings went, what you learned. You know, did you find out that they have a personal connection to bleeding disorders? Did they promise to support the bill? Did they have a question that we need to answer? So those are all things that that will come back to us. And then you can send an email or a handwritten note afterwards to thank them for their support or for their time. Okay, and then for those of you that might be on that perhaps aren't going to be able to participate with us on the day on Monday, you can also still support these issues and communicate your support by emailing your assembly member and senator, engaging on social media using the hashtags, and just continuing to stay informed about issues and reach out to those legislators that represent you on the issue. And we will have the toolkit that has sample letters and all of the talking points on our website, as well as sending it out to everyone who will be participating. Kind of along the same lines, we've talked a little bit about the social media piece. You know, use a photo. There are also some graphics in the toolkit if maybe the legislator's office, maybe they're one of the few that doesn't want to take a picture, right? So you can use the graphic from the toolkit instead. It's always great to follow your legislators on any of the platforms that they are active on. And then again, like I said, always be respectful in your posts, always assume that your posts are public and that people will see them. And then tag HCC and use the hashtags in any of your posts. The other thing that I will add to this, and we will remind the group leaders of this as well, is even if you go ahead and do your own post on social media, if you can text us the pictures as well or email them to us, that's really helpful for just future engagement and like us being able to capture all the photos from Legislative Day. Because if we try to save them off of social, we don't get the full sized photos, and so they don't print very well. If we wanted to use it, like you might get a great picture that we want to use in like next year's flyer or something. So if you could send them to us as well as posting them, that would be great. And if you are not on social media, take the picture and send it to us, and we will post it on our Hemophilia Council of California channels. Okay, we are at the end, but we do have a few more minutes. So that was a lot of information. And I felt like I kind of sped up there at the end because I knew we were kind of running down on time. Anybody need us to go back to any of those things and kind of go through some additional reminders or clarify questions? Yes, Legislative Day is Monday. That was one that just popped into me. For those that are future leaders, and you know who you are, we have 20 high school students that are coming to participate. They will be arriving on Saturday, and they will be with us through Tuesday. But then Legislative Day itself is just on Monday. Anyone who is in the Sacramento area or is coming in on Sunday in advance of future leaders, if you have not already signed up for our reception the night before, you could reach out to us and we can see if we're able to accommodate adding you to that. We would love to see you if you are going to be in town Sunday night. And then how many repeat future leaders versus new future leaders? I, off the top of my head, do not have an exact count, but I want to say it's probably about 50 to 60% returning and 40 to 50% new future leaders. It's kind of a good mix of returning and new. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat, unmute, and ask it.
I'm also available to take fun questions about what it's like to be in the swing space, because it's quite an odd but kind of cool building. Can also tell you what the best floor to get a photo of the Capitol is. If anybody wants to ask that question, I do have the answer. But yeah.
And I just put this in the chat. The office spaces are really small. Sometimes people are standing, maybe a couple people have a seat. Sometimes you're meeting in the hallway or one of the other spaces in the, in the corridor. So don't be upset if you end up in that situation, but it just adds a level of your presentation. It's not always quiet.
I'll go ahead and second that. It can be very chaotic. I know, just like, for example, in Assemblywoman Ransom's office, I usually compare it to the size of a very large closet. It is a very large closet, but they have, I think, a little tiny waiting room, usually with like 2-3 chairs in it, and then a little office space for like 3 staff to sit, and then the member has their own office. None of those are large spaces. So if you have a group of, say, 5 or more people, it's going to get tight wherever you're at. So if you meet with a staff person and they say, let's meet in the hallway, it's probably because they don't want to be like cramped and claustrophobic, especially if there's some other group that's in the office meeting, like in the actual elected official's office already. They might just say, let's go out in the hallway. and that is completely fine. Oh, and Lynn, I think there's a question in the chat that I don't know if I have the answer to.
Yeah, I was responding to that one while you were typing. Yeah, so April, you can follow up with me offline if you have more questions, because your questions are a little bit more specific to future leaders. But yes, our students, parents don't participate in future leaders, although they certainly are welcome and sometimes do then come just for legislative day. And then so whatever travel arrangements they make on their own, and the students are all paired with one other student that they room with during the event. So if you have other questions about that, I'll put my email in the chat. Or actually, I think I have it on the slide that I could go to. Yes, there we go. My email's at the bottom of this slide if there's any other specific follow-up questions for future leaders. And for future leaders and their parents who might be on the call, we will be sending some final, I mean, we've been in touch with you about travel and logistics and all of those things, but we will be there will be some final communications going out tomorrow and Friday, including me directly texting all of the parents to make sure that I have your contact information in my phone just in case we need it. And if you have any questions or concerns, we can certainly chat about that when I send you that message, or feel free to reach out to me in the meantime at the number or email that is on the slide deck. But I'm a mom myself, so I take very seriously the responsibility of guarding your children when they are in Sacramento. So, but we've had a great time the last few years, and I'm sure this is going to be a great group again. So I think that pretty much puts us at time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for taking time, not just tonight, but also this weekend and early next week to participate in advocacy. I feel like this is a time that it's never really been more critical than it is now, that we're advocating on behalf of these healthcare issues. And appreciate you joining us.